Housemarque is a Finnish game developer founded in 1995 from the merger of two other companies. They have a long history of creating different kinds of shoot-'em-up titles, including the Super Stardust series and Dead Nation. But they found huge success more recently with Resogun, a voxel-based side-scrolling twin-stick shooter that was a launch title for the PlayStation 4, and genuinely one of the better launch titles at that. It featured simple but addicting gameplay and an awesome aesthetic that featured tons of cool visual effects. With the resounding success of this little game, Housemarque would go on to gradually grow more ambitious with their games, releasing Alienation, Nex Machina, and Matterfall, all of which stayed true to their shoot-'em-up roots to varying degrees. However, eventually they decided to deviate from their usual niche by making a battle royale game called Stormdivers. It was originally anticipated for a 2019 release, but a long time went by without any news on it, until it was discovered that Housemarque put all projects on hold in order to shift their focus towards a different game, their most ambitious title to date. No one knew what it was initially, but it was speculated to be another game made with Sony for the PlayStation 5. And then it was revealed, Returnal, a AAA sci-fi third-person roguelike bullet hell with a psychological horror narrative. It's quite possibly the most daring combination of niche genres I've ever heard of, more so coming from a platform holder known for their rather safe investments in open-world action-adventure games. For a new IP, almost each of these genres would be a fairly hard sell to the masses individually, let alone merged together. From a first-party perspective, a game like this is a big risk, and that is the main reason as to why so many people were hesitant to spend a whopping $70 US on this game despite Housemarque's pedigree in the shoot-'em-up sphere. And that's the big question here. Is this ambitious amalgam of niche genres worth such a hefty price, even for hardcore shoot-'em-up or roguelike enthusiasts? That's what this review is looking to answer. So without any further ado, let's get into it. In Returnal, you play as Celine, a reconnaissance scout for Astra Corporation who crash lands on a very dangerous, eerie alien planet named Atropos after attempting to follow a strange signal. Upon first arriving, she quickly discovers corpses of herself and realizes she's stuck in some sort of vicious time loop that even death won't free her from. Furthermore, every time she dies, the planet itself shifts terrain. She experiences strange events and visions that the player must piece together and encounters hostile life forms to defeat in order to find out what the true origin of the signal is and why she can't escape the planet. As you can see, the story is written in such a way that it directly utilizes and addresses common traits of a roguelike game, namely restarting a cycle from the beginning and randomized tile sets. This narrative doesn't just exist for the sake of it. You might normally assume that any attempt at a story in such a gameplay-focused title would offer little to the experience, if not actively hinder it. But that's not the case in Returnal. If anything, the story is a vehicle for some pretty gripping plot-related sequences that add a layer of intrigue, mystery, and spookiness on top of the fast-paced, explosive combat. You'll find voice logs scattered around the map left behind by past versions of Celine, reveal more information on the world and enemies through text databases, and then every major chunk of progress is punctuated by important first-person scenes where you explore visions of Celine's home. In some cases, you may even look forward to taking a break from blasting aliens to uncover the next piece of the puzzle and inch closer to finding out the truth. Housemarque does a fantastic job of implementing a sincerely fascinating, unsettling narrative into a game that doesn't seem like it would have that if you judged it solely by combat footage. However, due to the structure of the game, there's only so many pieces of information you can find before you need to progress in order to discover more. If you're stuck in Act 1, for example, and have basically cleaned up everything you can possibly find in the first 3 biomes, you may go hours without experiencing any narrative advancement. So if you are truly gripped by the plot, but aren't so good at the actual fighting, you might be in for a tough time. Obviously, a big contributor to a horror game's atmosphere and world is graphics, and Returnal looks very good considering how incredibly busy the action can get. The different zones feature areas and rooms that are dense with environmental detail, lush foliage, small and large structures, far draw distances, and some destructible assets too. According to Digital Foundry, Returnal's native resolution is actually 1080p, which is then upsampled to 1440p, then checkerboard rendered to a full 4K. Now this might have you wondering, wait a second, it's not native 4K, it's upsampled and checkerboarded? Does that mean everything's all blurry? The answer to that is no. You don't have to worry about any major anti-aliasing shortcomings making everything fuzzy or jaggy. The visuals are still quite clean and crisp for the vast majority of the experience. Admittedly, whenever you come across an odd moment or two where the camera pulls in really close to some surfaces, you can see some blurriness in certain textures. But those little imperfections will go largely unnoticed as you speed through biomes and frantically try to survive hordes of deadly alien foes during normal combat. The most obvious thing about the game's visual style is the incredible explosions of colorful particle effects that contrast with the otherwise bleak and grimy aesthetic of the setting. If you've played Housemarque games before, then you know they love their particles, and Returnal is no exception to that affinity. Shockwaves, lasers, tentacles, machinery, and hundreds of neon bullets fly across the screen at once in some of the more intense fights you'll come across. Boss fights in particular are practically like going to a rave. Enemy models can also be very busy in themselves, featuring lots of individually moving parts, particularly those tentacles. Part of the challenge the game presents is keeping track of all the visual chaos and making note of what's coming from where, and jumping and dodging accordingly. The aesthetic of the game's UI and HUD is also really pleasing, bearing a resemblance to the type of look you'd see in 1980s sci-fi movies, but modernized just a tiny bit. I also really like how Housemarque places so much information in the center of the screen, namely the ammo counter, overload meter, and alt-fire notifications, so you hardly ever have to peel your eyes away from the general center of your television. But with this combination of detailed settings and particle pandemonium all happening on screen, you may be wondering how this game manages to perform. If the fast-paced combat is so important, then it'd be really disappointing if it didn't maintain a solid 60 frames per second, right? Well, good news on that front, because in my experience, the frame rate has been quite consistent. It's not a perfectly immovable 60, the occasional dip does exist, but it's nowhere near problematic or inhibitive for the gameplay. The complex multi-step upscaling techniques mentioned earlier are no doubt a huge contributor to this consistency. In another aspect of performance, there's loading times, which are damn near non-existent. It's absolutely incredible how little time is spent on waiting for areas to load. The SSD once again amazes. Even when you step through a teleporter to be sent to a completely different biome with completely different assets and surrounding horizons, the wait you'd normally expect from a game like this on a hard disk drive just isn't there. The new zone is loaded in a snap, a blink. It's done before you have time to even consider fiddling with your phone while you wait. It's very impressive. But the SSD isn't the only piece of the PS5's hardware that's expertly utilized. The 3D audio is truly remarkable and adds a whole new level of immersion. The vibrations in the body of the DualSense differ in strength and frequency as you use different weapons, get hit by enemies, or even run through certain terrain. But there's one specific thing that really stands out. Returnal has the best usage of the haptic triggers I've experienced so far. I've played a few games that use them, and some are pretty clever and feel very good. But Returnal is the first I've seen to use the variable pull weight in order to give two functions to one button. Let me explain. As a third-person shooter, Returnal obviously allows you to hold down the L2 button to zoom in a bit to allow for more precision aiming. It's a very common thing to do in games with guns. But L2 also allows you to use secondary fire on your weapons. You might think, wait a second, does that mean I can't zoom in without using secondary fire? And the answer is no, because the game uses L2's haptics to put a hard stop on the trigger at the halfway point of pressing down. A slight push of the left trigger allows you to aim like you normally would, but a full press switches to secondary fire, so you can accomplish either action without ever taking your finger off L2. Of course, if you're not into that control scheme, you're still free to change it. Now that all that stuff is out of the way, it's time to discuss the meat and potatoes of Returnal, the gameplay. As I've already stated, it's a third-person hybrid of shmups, roguelikes, and a bit of Metroid for good measure, and some psychological horror to grease the wheels. It's a pretty ambitious combination of niche genres, and you would think that Housemarque might be bound to slip up on one of them, but miraculously enough, they don't. So let's start from the top. Structurally, Returnal's approach to its roguelike elements are pretty straightforward. There's several zones or biomes. Each one has its own tile set with a large pool of different rooms to randomly attach together, and they divide into the main path, which leads to progression, and side paths that lead to extra artifacts, new weapons, or currency, of which there are two types, called obolites and ether, with the latter being permanent. It's fairly common for the game to generate a tile set that has locked doors that require keys you get later in the zone, making backtracking necessary at points if you want to completely clear it out. A huge aspect of roguelikes or lights is snatching up as many buffs as you can find to make the subsequent zones a bit easier, and Returnal has a vast library of items and methods to buff yourself with and increase your stats. First, there's artifacts, which are straight buffs that grant new effects that might greatly turn the tide of any battles you face. They range from fairly standard but still useful things like a small percentage of increased damage or stagger to stuff that you might always want to grab when you have the opportunity, like a free revive or temporarily increased speed and defense on a melee kill. Then there's parasites, which are little bugs you find around the game that Celine attaches to herself for a buff at the price of a debuff as well. These parasites can potentially give you some incredibly useful effects, but they can also give you very debilitating ones too. Whenever you find one, it's up to you to weigh the pros and cons and decide whether you want to keep them or not. Then, of course, there's consumables. They range anywhere from time-limited buffs to exchanging one type of resource to another, and to just normal heals of varying levels of potency. With the combination of artifacts, parasites, and consumables, there's a lot of ways where your run can go either very right or very wrong. And that doesn't even take into account malfunctions, which is another possible penalty to your stats or movement that must meet certain requirements to be repaired. Considering its randomized nature, everything depends on how merciful RNGesus feels like being. But it doesn't stop at just those things. Weapons have their own fair share of randomized attributes too. They have a pool of secondary fire attacks to spawn with, and unique traits that can change how they work. For example, there's the Spitmaw Blaster, which is the game's shotgun. The most obvious traits are a narrower spread so more pellets can hit a single target, or a wider spread for a greater crowd control, or slug rounds, which grants an additional high-power slug with each blast. There's about 8 or so possible traits for each weapon, and with luck, you might find a combination of those traits that greatly benefits your playstyle. There is one thing to address about the game's items, equipment, buffs, debuffs, and weapon traits. It's a pretty common thing in roguelites and lights for the player to acquire so many different skills along the way to the end of a run that by the time they hit the third or fourth zone, it looks like they're practically playing a different game entirely. Discovered skills and traits drastically affect the stuff you do and damn near change the core combat of the game. Returnal isn't necessarily like that, and this may come at the dismay of some people who were expecting discoverables to really turn things on their head. No matter how many artifacts you acquire, parasites you stick on yourself, or consumables you hoard, the combat loop stays very much the same throughout the entire game. There's a few really flashy weapon traits that might add some spice to things, like the portal beam or portal turret traits for the Holoseeker, which summon auto-firing floating portals every certain number of rounds you shoot. Matter of fact, if you're lucky enough to find a Holoseeker with portal beam, portal turret, serrated projectiles, and waves all at once, like I did in the 5th biome, then you've found yourself a god weapon that will carry you through the rest of the game. But still, it doesn't necessarily change the crux of the combat loop, powerful as it may be. This also extends to permanent upgrades that you carry from run to run. A common thing in a roguelite, which are much more popular than traditional roguelikes, is allowing the player to slowly increase their power permanently, so eventually they reach a point where finishing a run is basically a foregone conclusion. Hades, for example, has multiple resources you can spend to achieve this, but Returnal doesn't have this. When you restart a run, you truly restart a run. There are some permanent pieces of equipment, yes, but they're all tied to story progression and you're guaranteed to get them anyway. The only non-essential permanent upgrades you can get are items and weapon traits you discover or unlock for the first time, which then simply adds them to the pool of discoverables. So you don't make progress by strengthening Selene with each run. Instead, you make progress by earning the right to discover more potentially useful things in subsequent runs. However, don't let that lack of gradual but major evolution allow you to assume that Returnal's combat is boring or shallow. This game boasts a very robust gameplay foundation that doesn't necessarily need that evolution. Guns still feel amazing to use, and traversal and movement is simply impeccable. Returnal's combat is seriously best in class among action-focused third-person shooters. Jumps and dodges are super reliable, grapple hooking allows you to get out of tight spots and cover a ton of ground really quickly, on-foot movement is quick and responsive, and your melee attack is crazy strong and actually worth using. This is all super important in a game that greatly encourages the player to never stop moving. If I had to make some sort of comparison, I would say Returnal's combat is like a significantly beefed up version of Control, which I actually played for the first time earlier this year, so the experience is still somewhat fresh in my memory. Even if Returnal's gameplay weren't randomized in any way and were just a normal, linear 12-hour game, the combat and controls would still be amazing. It's addicting to the point where even if I momentarily walk away from the game due to a miserably failed run, I get the itch to hop back on just minutes later. Housemarque has always been reliable when it comes to making highly enjoyable combat loops, and Returnal is no exception. Speaking of failed runs, however, I finally want to take the opportunity to dive into some criticisms. As great of a foundation this game is built on, as amazing as the combat actually is, and as ambitious of a genre amalgam it may be, it's still not perfect. Returnal, like most games, suffers from a couple of small but mildly annoying inconveniences. For example, the game has a minimap that doesn't distinguish between normal items and items that are malignant or spoiled, which harm the player. They still have different models, so you aren't forced to pick up an infected item, but I've spent a lot of wasted time running to green crosses on my minimap expecting a normal piece of Silphium to heal me, only to find a malignant one instead, which might actually finish me off, which has happened. Putting a purple cross on the minimap to distinguish malignant healing items would be a great quality of life addition. Also, having used fabricators be grayed out would be nice as well. Unfortunately, these small and ultimately benign problems aren't the only thing the game suffers from. There's one big, glaring issue that many have complained about and Housemarque themselves have already acknowledged: the lack of save states. Many of the most popular roguelites don't take very long to accomplish a successful run. 30, 40, maybe 50 minutes max. Returnal, however, wouldn't deign to be that short. The game is divided into two halves, zones 1 through 3 and 4 through 6, and one run means doing only one of those halves. So you might think, well, that doesn't sound too bad, but here's the thing. Depending on how thorough you're trying to be in clearing each zone, a full run can still approach or even cross 3 whole hours. This is a huge deal because the game doesn't have save states that allow you to just turn off the game in the middle of one of these long runs and continue later. In fact, when you start the game for the first time, it straight up tells you if you wish to take a break, your only choice is to put the console in rest mode. This is a massive problem for a ton of reasons. What if I share my PlayStation 5 with family or roommates and they want to play something? What if I want to play something else for a bit? What if the power goes out? What if the game crashes? So on and so forth. Well, in all of those cases, you're just shit out of luck, and that's really aggravating. It's enough of an endurance test that a run in Returnal can last so long to begin with, but the lack of save states just pushes the game's difficulty from challenging but fair to aggressively user-unfriendly. And speaking of crashes, I've experienced multiple ones, so it's not like the scenario is out of the question. In my 20 hours of playing, the game has frozen once and crashed to the PS5 home screen 3 times. And one of those instances I was actually in the middle of a pretty good run. And of course I had no save state to rescue me. As mentioned, Housemarque has already acknowledged this issue and have said they'll be adding save states later. But until then, keep this information in mind. And as much as it pains me to say, it still doesn't stop there. There's an odd sound bug that can cause the game's audio to completely cut out. Putting the console in rest mode and then waking it up again seems to fix it, but sadly I discovered that too late. I personally encountered the audio glitch at the very end of the 6th zone, and I experienced and beat the final boss for the first time with no sound. Kind of a letdown. Of course, there's also the whole save game debacle that happened with update 1.3.3, where people's saves became irreparably damaged, but that was immediately rolled back and a hotfix was out within 12 hours. So effectively, that's not an issue to really worry about anymore. Funnily enough though, I actually survived that whole situation because I downloaded that update and started up the game multiple times with no problems. Anyway, Returnal does have a couple of gigantic, hyper-specific problems that are hard to not keep in mind as you play. It's really hard committing to a good run when you know that the game can crash and you'll have no way to pick up where you left off thanks to the absence of save states. It's a fear that looms over you. This is really unfortunate because the game is excellent. I've had a blast playing it even in spite of these issues. The combat is engaging and rewarding, the environments and visuals are extremely pretty, the story is gripping, and the performance is stellar when it's not bugging out. If you're really interested in this game and don't mind the lack of save states, then it is 100% worth buying right now. Otherwise, simply wait for that update that adds those states. That's really the one thing this game needs at the moment. Overall, Housemarque's Returnal symbolizes something that you wouldn't normally expect from a platform holder as big as PlayStation: the willingness to take risks. I've said this a few times already, but it bears another repeat. This is not your typical open-world action-adventure game meant to appeal to everyone who plays games. It's a roguelike bullet hell with a very cryptic psychological horror story. A very strange hybrid of niche genres that you wouldn't anticipate getting a AAA treatment, but here we are. Returnal is a very standout title among other PlayStation Studios games that follow the same vague outline, and is emblematic of the kind of risks that I want Sony to take more often. It's easy for them to make the safe choice in another Horizon, another God of War, another Last of Us, even another Ghost of Tsushima, as much as I loved that game. But I honestly want to see stuff like Returnal more often, and I hope Sony delivers. This concludes my review of Returnal. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.
The fog has dispersed, and the energy signature is gone.